Hello everyone, welcome to this week's topic, which is materials development. As you know, I'm Andrea Sanchez, and this week we are going to be talking about a really interesting topic and an area that sometimes is forgotten in our profession, and I think it's going to be really interesting and useful for you. So welcome and please enjoy the topic. The history of materials development is as old as that of language teaching, but it was not until the mid-1990s that materials development really began to be treated seriously by academics and teacher educators. Before then, it was often dismissed as something that practitioners did, or it was treated as subsection of methodology in which materials were usually introduced as examples of methods in action rather than as means to explore the principles and procedures of the development. It was in the middle of the 1990s that universities stimulated institutions and teachers' training to give more time and consideration to materials development. In 1993, Brian Tomlinson founded the International Materials Development Association, known as the MATSTA. They ran conferences and workshops, and they published a journal called Folio. And around that time, such associations as YALT in Japan, MISELT in Malaysia, and TESOL in the United States set up materials development special interest groups. Nowadays, there are a number of dedicated materials development MAs, and most universities and teachers training institutions run materials development modules. Nowadays, materials development is considered to be both a practical undertaking and a field of academic study. As a practical undertaking, it involves the production, evaluation, and adaptation and delivery of materials. As a field, it studies the principles and procedures of the design, writing, implementation, and evaluation of materials. Key issues: should materials be driven by repertoire or by principles? In recent years, a number of publications have focused on how materials developers typically write ELT materials. Literature reveals that many experienced writers rely on their intuitions about what works and make frequent use of activities from their repertoire that seem to fit with their objectives. Not many writers seem to be actually guided by a prior articulation of learning principles. This literature does, however, provide some examples of writers who develop materials from a set of principles. When developing materials, writers insist that we should start by asking ourselves the crucial question: how do we think people learn languages? Principles help authors make compromises to meet the practical needs of teachers and learners and to match the realities of publishing materials. Now, in your case, as future teachers, you should always ask yourself this question: what material should I use? What book should I advise my students? What is the best dictionary that I can use for my class? Remember, there are so many options for teaching English. Remember that the important thing is that you are in charge. You are the teachers, and you are going to be the ones choosing the proper materials. Be careful, because sometimes some institutions try to force you to use certain materials or probably certain publishing house. Also, be careful with recommendations of other teachers. Now, probably some materials work for them, but do you think those materials are good enough for you? Maybe those materials are not going to be useful for your students. Or maybe students are not going to be able to reproduce the language. Maybe they simply won't like the material. So just make sure that you don't actually get married with any publishing house or any author or any book. Just make sure that you make a very conscious and responsible decision about the materials that you are going to use. Should materials be realized as textbooks? So the question is, to textbook or not to textbook? For more than 30 years, there has been a discussion about whether or not textbooks are an effective way of delivering language learning materials to learners. Proponents of textbooks claim that the textbook is a cost-effective way of providing the learner with security, system, progress, and revision, and that at the same time it saves the teacher precious time and provides resources to base the lessons on. It also helps administrators to achieve course credibility, to timetable lessons, and to standardize teaching in their institutions. Opponents of textbooks argue that textbooks disempower both the teacher and the learners. They don't actually answer to actual needs and wants of their users and can provide only an illusion of system and progress. They also argue that a course book is inevitably superficial and reductionist in its coverage of language points and its provision of language experience. My view is that a textbook can do all that its proponents say it does, but that unfortunately many commercial textbooks are not engaging or relevant for their users. In order to change this situation, publishers would need to take financial risks and develop textbooks that follow principles of language acquisition rather than imitate their best-selling predecessors. Can global materials satisfy learners' needs and wants, or should all materials be local? Most best-selling materials are global materials, that is, materials designed for use with any learner at a particular level anywhere. Obviously, such materials provide publishers with the best opportunities for profit as their sales potential is great, but can they provide all their users or even one user with what they need and want? In my experience of language classrooms in many years, global textbooks attract teachers and learners everywhere because of their high production values and their face validity, but they inevitably fail to engage learners anywhere. How can materials which have been designed to meet the generalized needs and wants of virtual groups of learners meet the needs and wants of actual learners who are learning English in a specific environment with specific objectives? This is why this is a huge opportunity for you guys. Probably you are going to become teachers, and maybe you could start thinking about becoming future producers of these kinds of materials, producers, writers, or anything that is going to help to create materials. In Mexico, we are in great need of materials that are local, materials that are Mexican, and that of course are contextualized to our needs and our people. So open your eyes, this is a big job opportunity for you guys. Should textbooks be developed as scripts or as resources? This is actually a very important situation because you have to adapt or you will die. Most textbooks seem to be designed to be used as scripts. They tell both the learners and the teachers what to do, when to do it, and how to do it. This probably appeals to most administrators who are usually the people who decide what books to buy, and it can actually help them to standardize. It probably also appeals to many teachers as it plans their lessons for them. However, textbooks designed as scripts to follow are aimed to idealized groups of stereotypical learners and cannot possibly match the needs and wants of any class of actual learners. There is some evidence that confident teachers treat textbooks as a resource rather than a script regardless of their design. But there is also evidence that less confident teachers regard international textbooks as superior and follow them as scripts. This is really sad and unfortunate. There is an argument, therefore, that textbooks needs to be designed as resources to be made selective use of by teachers. The reality is that every textbook needs adapting every time it is used because every group of learners is different from every other and it has different needs and wants. People have different needs and wants. There are a number of publications suggesting ways of adapting textbooks. So please just keep this in mind when selecting a textbook. Just make sure that you adapt it and that you don't follow it exactly how they propose you to do so. Probably you are going to choose certain activities, or probably you are going to skip some activities that actually are not interesting for your group, or maybe your students don't want to do it, so or maybe it's you that you don't want to do it. So just feel free to skip anything you want and make sure that you make really responsible decisions about this. Should materials be written to focus on predetermined teaching points, or should they make use of authentic texts and tasks? Much has been written on the issue of authenticity, and some experts consider that it is useful to focus attention on a feature of a language by removing distracting difficulties and complexities from sample texts. By focusing on the target feature in easy-to-understand examples, such materials claim to make the learning task simpler. The argument for authentic materials, remember that the authentic materials are those that are not specifically developed for language teaching, is that they expose learners to language as it is typically used and that they prepare them for the reality they will encounter as users of the language. Of course, using authentic material is time-consuming because for you teachers, you have to decide which material you are going to use, the kind of video, the kind of magazine, or the kind of text. Fortunately, we have ICT resources that are all over the internet platforms, as you know, or probably online environments that are going to help us to select materials that are more adequate for our groups. Of course, authentic materials bring us the opportunity to actually have access to more authentic speech. We can use materials from the radio, from interviews, from TV shows, movies, etc. And authentic materials are always going to be fascinating for your students. Now, be careful. Experts actually advise that authentic materials should be used more with students that are intermediate. So we are talking about B1 students, B2 obviously, and advanced students. So just be careful. It doesn't mean that beginner learners cannot use authentic materials. Of course they can. Just be careful on the selection and make sure that they can understand the materials that you propose to them. Should materials be safe or provocative? Well, my advice is that you always stay safe, but of course take some risks, because if you don't take some risks, probably you are playing too safe and probably it's going to be really boring. Commercial publishers understandably play safe when publishing global course books. They make sure that they avoid text, photos, and activities that might cause offense, disturbance, or embarrassment. In doing so, they make sure that the institutions and the teachers who use their materials are safe from accusation and that they themselves are safe from prosecution. Unfortunately, though, this caution often leads to the publication of books that are sanitized, bland, and boring, in which harmony, cooperation, and agreement prevail, and in which the learners are insulted by the portrayal of an unreal English world where fear, danger, sickness, satire, conflict, criticism, disagreement, and even apprehension do not exist. This means that the learners can spend an entire semester not laughing, not being moved, not thinking, and not being stimulated at all. As always, I always give this recommendation. Always balance. It's not like that you have to provoke students, but just make sure that you provoke in them emotions. It doesn't mean that you have to bring to class very unsafe topics or controversial topics. It means that probably if you feel free to do so, you can share with them some very controversial topics. Just be careful. Remember that it's up to you how students feel, how students receive the materials, and the way the materials are treated. So in general, just be safe, balance. That's it. What roles can new technologies play in facilitating language acquisition? For a long time now, technology has played an important role in supplementing course books, and in some countries, many language learners spend more time working at a computer, watching a television screen, or listening to some podcast or some audios. They prefer to do this than working with a book. Recently, new media such as chat lines, Facebook, and other social networking sites such as blogs, virtual worlds, and cell phones have started to be used not only as a way to transmit language learning materials, but as means for providing opportunities for communicative interaction. The advantage of making use of technology can include motivational and experiential benefits of multimodal representation of the language, opportunities for listening to and observing proficient language users communicating, opportunities for revisiting language activities and experiences, opportunities for personalization of the course by the learners, opportunities for interaction at a distance, just like we are doing right now, and a match with the expectations of new generations of language learners. Many people would also argue, though, that many materials that use new technologies are too expensive or are dependent on proper maintenance of equipment, just repeat the activities of textbooks in less effective ways, dehumanize language learning by reducing human interaction. This is not true, though, according to me. Or maybe these activities are driven by the possibilities of the technology rather than by the principles of pedagogy. Most of the above complaints seem to be about the abuse of new technologies rather than their potential, and it is likely that in the future technology-driven materials will be developed which are more economical, humanistic, principled, and effective. So I think that we as future teachers have to be conscious that technology is over here, everywhere, and more every day, right? So just make sure that, again, you balance the use of technology. Of course, if we are in the middle of a pandemic, just like right now, we just have to make use of technology just to communicate with students, to have class with the students. Just make sure that when you go back to face-to-face teaching, to make a balanced use of technology. So, what's there for you to say? You as a future English teachers, what are your thoughts on everything you just heard? Do you agree? Do you disagree? Well, in a little bit, you are going to tell me in a small activity that I have planned for you. So, thanks for watching and listening, and see you soon. Take care.